It's a great pleasure to introduce Timo Aava, our current Estonia Oxford postdoctoral visiting fellow in Antony. Timo is a historian of modern Europe with a focus on political thought and minority rights. And today I believe he'll be presenting to us on his book project, which focuses on sort of political and intellectual history of minority rights in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. But he also has a series of very interesting publications on diasporic nationalisms and ideas of non-territorial autonomy, for example, among Estonians in Siberia after the Bolshevik Revolution and Jews in interwar Estonia. Timo holds a PhD from the University of Vienna and has come to us via a sort of classic postdoc itinerary of multiple prestigious fellowships at LSE, Harvard, Yale, among others, including the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, which holds a special place in my heart. After St. Antony, he will move on to work on 2 projects at the University of Tartu. So it is very good to have him with us here today and for the next few weeks. And comment will be given by Martin Conway, our history faculty chair at the moment. So I'm quite amazed that you've managed to find time to be here. But this is very reflective of Martin's generosity intellectually and in supporting younger scholars. Martin has wide-ranging interests, as I'm sure you'll all know, from the far right to Catholic politics, to democracy, to masculinity, to histories of the present, and of course Belgium, which I suppose gives him a special sort of grounds for providing comments today on Timo's paper. So, Timo, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for this very kind introduction. I also want to thank Martin for being part of the panel here today. And of course, I also want to express my gratitude to the center for hosting me, as well as the college. I'm really happy to be part of the crowd here. So in 1937, the Austrian politician Karl Renner wrote, "The so-called cultural autonomy of Estonia may, for the time being, be regarded as the fullest attempt at constitutional arrangement of national self-government in a multinational state. Its beneficial effects are undisputed." So Karl Renner, this gentleman with impressive moustache, he was one of the most influential politicians in Austria under different political regimes. And this quote is from one of his treatises where he revisits national question, one of his many treatises on the national question, and the topic with which he had started to work on almost 40 years ago. And with this work, he tried to reorganize the Habsburg Empire to avoid its fragmentation into smaller nation states. So what Renner referred here in this quote was the law on cultural self-government for national minorities adopted by the Estonian parliament in February 1925. It was passed after several years of parliamentary campaign, mainly led by the Baltic Germans, the former elite in the Baltic space. And it allowed minorities to establish their cultural self-government bodies to independently administer their cultural and educational affairs. 2 minorities used this law, Baltic Germans and the Jews. They established their self-government bodies. And the powers of minority self-government bodies were curtailed after authoritarian coup in 1934, but they remained, the system remained in place up until the end of Estonian statehood in 1940. So what I'm going to do today in this talk, I'm trying to reconstruct this transnational intellectual history of this group rights model, the idea of non-territorial autonomy. And I want to show that this Estonian case and the law that I mentioned earlier, that this was part of this larger conversation about how modern multi-ethnic states should be organized. And I'm particularly interested in how minority rights activists, as well as majority politicians, how they conceptualize rights and what were the sources of their thinking. And in so doing, I will kind of show both that Renner was right and wrong. Indeed, Renner and his ideas were highly influential in these debates. Many relied on his and other Austro-Marxist thinkers. But at the same time, these lawmaking, these debates in the final decades of the Romanov Empire were much more complicated process of translating, adapting various ideas, but also relying on the local political, cultural traditions, as well as pre-existing group-specific self-governance models, for instance, in the case of Jewish Baltic German. And before moving on, it's worth asking why should we study this case in the first place. So in the interval period, the Estonian legislation very much served as a model for many minority activists across Europe. So we will hear a bit more about it later. And in historiography, it has also been highlighted that this Estonian case was an exceptional case of accommodating minorities within nation states. And also a very important case in the larger story of non-territorial autonomy. The Irish political scientist John Coakley, for instance, has described the Estonian case as the poster child of non-territorial autonomy. And finally, and even more importantly, I think this case allows us to think more broadly about these political transformations in the European political order in the first half of the 20th century. And it shows how important various other alternatives were, in addition to nation states, which then started to dominate the European political map. So, in her recent monograph, Natasha Wheatley, the title of which, the picture of which you saw in the previous slide, she argues that the complex internal structure of the Habsburg Empire and attempts to make sense of it proved highly influential for modern notions of statehood, sovereignty. And indeed, the Habsburg complex was a laboratory of where thinkers and politicians discussed various forms of autonomy and federalism. In some parts of the empire, such as Moravia and Bohemia, were indeed ethnically so diverse that it was very complicated to apply this common idea of establishing neat mono-ethnic territorial units. So this map visualizes this kind of problem that many politicians were faced with. So Karl Renner from the Austrian Social Democratic Party was the chief theoretician of non-territorial autonomy and started to work on this topic since the turn of the century. And he argued that, here I quote, that the nations should be constituted not as territorial entities, but as personal associations. End of quote. And basically following the model of religious communities which function side by side, overlapping within the same territory, this should be also applied to nationalities. This was his idea. So to avoid exclusive dominance of one nationality within a specific territorial unit. So in a way, he argued for decoupling territory and nation in situation. And his vision foresaw dividing the entire population of the empire into these non-territorial autonomy bodies which would then independently administer group-specific educational and cultural affairs. And rest of the common political affairs be discussed jointly within imperial instructions, imperial parliament. So in a way, he argues for two things, to separate nation and territory, but also to separate politics and culture. Otto Bauer also joined the discussions. In his account, he put stronger Marxist flavor in the entire concept. And in this Habsburg social democratic discourse, this autonomy model served the goal of kind of putting the national question aside, leaving the national question to the nationalities themselves. The idea was that no need to waste energy on discussing in which language should be street signs and so on. We should put them aside, and then we could focus on more important questions such as workers' rights, class struggle, and so on. And the idea was to hold empire together to avoid its fragmentation into smaller states. So, nevertheless, in the Habsburg Empire, it never became an official policy, even though actually the Social Democratic Party never adopted it as an official policy. But it proved highly influential in political discussions, and even more influential in the neighboring empire, in the Romanov Empire, which was also a multi-ethnic one. 1897 census showed that Russians actually formed less than 50% of the entire population. And in this Romanov imperial state reform discourse, and in the ideas of various national movements, this form of autonomy was very influential. Various Jewish politicians, Jewish parties played particularly an important role here. One of the first to advocate for this form of autonomy for Russian Jewish communities was historian Simon Dubnov, who kind of applied this Hegelian dialectic. Thesis was this medieval Jewish isolationism, antithesis is modern Jewish assimilation, but the synthesis should be Jewish autonomy. So in practical terms, this meant kind of transforming the pre-existing religious communities into secular bodies of self-governance. And many other national movements later followed and incorporated these ideas into their political programs, agendas. The most important opponents in this story were the Bolsheviks, who engaged in intense debates over the Austro-Marxist autonomy model, and within the Soviet state, territorialized national territorial federal principle, but incorporating also some territorial autonomy. So if we move to the Baltic provinces, I won't stop here on this slide too long, but it's worth keeping in mind that there were no kind of ethnically defined borders until the spring of 1917. What later formed Estonia was basically two separate governorates. Northern Estonia, the governorate of Estland, was predominantly Estonian-speaking. The governorate of Livland was basically territories which later formed southern Estonia and northern Latvia. And in the Baltic context, what is also important to keep in mind, Baltic Germans had been historically the upper class, culturally, politically, dominant class, and later on, when it comes to the Baltic German question, was made at the heart of debates over autonomy. And also briefly, if you look at the ethnic composition of Estonia in the interwar period, then Estonia was ethnically diverse, but if we compare it with other Central European states, then it was slightly more homogeneous, which might have contributed to the fact that Estonia introduced this law. The average share of minorities was 30%. In Estonia, it was a bit over 10%. So In Russia, the outbreak of February Revolution basically it brought intense debates over the political future of the former imperial space. It was a feverish period of various all Russian, regional, national congresses, party meetings, program making, debates, various forms of federalism and autonomy were at the heart of these debates. And in the Estonian context, two names were at the heart of these debates, Karl Lutz and Hans Kruus. Karl Lutz was an Estonian social democrat. He was born and raised in St. Petersburg, so he was kind of part of the Estonian diaspora community there. And the other activist was Hans Kruus, a young aspiring historian, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. And they were the most important advocates. They wrote articles and pamphlets on the topic, speeches, and so on. And there are three things that I would like to highlight regarding their work on autonomy. I think their work, firstly, it shows how these debates were part of the larger discussion, both in the Habsburg and the Romanov imperial spaces, part of the circulation and adaptation of this idea. They both relied on the works of Karl Renner and Dr. Bauer. Sometimes they cited actually the Russian translations of these works, so it kind of also shows this mediated approach to these ideas. But they also refer to other advocates within the Russian Empire, such as Lebow. And Kruus is even more interesting in this regard because his ideas very much developed within the Socialist Revolutionary Party framework. So in spring 1917, he attended big party meetings in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And when he returned to Estonia after these congresses, he immediately started writing articles and advocating this idea, basically advocating the program, the nationalities program that had been adopted at the party meeting. And secondly, with their accounts framing their ideas in the language of decentralization and national self-determination, they put forward strong arguments for non-territorial autonomy. They highlighted all the issues that would arise if one would try to create neat ethno-territorial units, such as cutting off essential ties, cutting off economic ties, and so on. However, they never questioned the already created Estonian territorial autonomy. This had been already created by that point when they wrote their works. They kind of took it for granted, and for them, the idea was to have both territorial and non-territorial autonomy provisions. And why and for whom did they then advocate this form of autonomy? It was the Estonian diaspora, actually, the other parts of Russia. And it's worth briefly stopping on this question. So in the Baltic provinces, the harvestable agricultural land had been predominantly owned by the Baltic German landowners. When Estonian and Latvian peasants were emancipated at the beginning of the 19th century, then they were emancipated without land. So they had to buy it out, and this kind of triggers as part of this larger Russian campaign to settle various parts of the empire. This kind of created big waves of migration into Siberia, into Caucasians. So around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, there were roughly 200,000, 250,000 Estonians in other parts of Russia, whereas in Estonia, the entire population was roughly 1 million. So in the eyes of these national activists, these were huge numbers. These were possibly people who could assimilate and the national bodies. So for them, this form of autonomy was very much a tool to keep the diasporic communities part of the national body. I avoid assimilation and be in touch with the homeland. And there were intense debates here in Siberia around that time. I won't stop here further, but there were intense discussions going on. the topic. So it's worth asking, how did the promise of this form of autonomy, non-territorial autonomy, become one of the core principles of nascent independent Estonia? So by the end of 1917, many political movements, as I mentioned, had adopted this kind of idea in various forms in their programs. And previously, during 1917, the entire political debate had been, what should be Estonia's role within the new reformed, possibly federal Russia? So independence was never really strongly favored option. Small states seem vulnerable and impractical. But of course, the October Revolution changed the situation. Bolsheviks take power. It was still World War I, and German forces were approaching from the south. So the Estonian political elite decided to seize the opportunity and declare independence. And in this moment, they were also faced with the question of that the new state would be also ethnically diverse. There was this necessity to gain support from Baltic Germans and other minorities for the new state project. And also the international arena was very much in the minds of the national elites, because there were intense debates already going on over the post-war order and also the rights of. And basically an answer to all these issues was readily there in the toolbox ideas, the idea of territorial. So the manifesto, it included this promise for national cultural autonomy. It was in a very high position in the list of principles of the new state, point number 2. And it was really picked up from these earlier debates. Some people who were drafting the manifesto had been part of these previous debates, and also the language they use, national cultural autonomy, very much shows that it was kind of part of this previous discourse. And this now, from here on, served as a starting point for later discussions of autonomy. So what followed was basically designing a minority protection arrangement for a new nation state. This principle was first included in the constitution and later fleshed out in special autonomy. And now the Baltic Germans emerged as the most important campaigners and prepared numerous law drafts. And this was also a time of change for Baltic German communities. A new generation of Baltic German politicians emerged, mostly with non-noble background, because previously it had been mainly nobility who had dominated Baltic German politics, but activists, thinkers, politicians such as Albert Spindler, Werner Hasselblatt, they emerged now. And they were more democratically minded, more liberally minded, and also more open to compromise. Swedes, Jews, and Russians were also involved in the lawmaking process, but they had a secondary role for sure. Baltic Germans were the most important ones. And you see that it took 5 years to introduce this law, and what prolonged the entire process was still a very strong anti-German sentiments among Estonian national elites. One was this centuries-old Baltic German dominance, but even more importantly, the fresh experience during the First World War, when some Baltic German politicians had collaborated with the German occupation. And in these debates, both minority activists and also Estonian majority politicians, they took basically a theoretically grounded choice for this form of autonomy, for non-territorial autonomy. Baltic Germans, who were the main advocates there, they lived in dispersed communities, so there were no kind of territorially compact Baltic German units, so it kind of very much corresponded to their settlement structures. they relied in this process on a rich body of literature, whereas other laws based on which they drafted their law drafts, and also Bauer and Renner now featured prominently in this lawmaking process, both for Baltic German politicians, but also Estonian majority politicians. And their ideas kind of functioned in three ways. First, as a theoretical basis, so many drafted their law visions based on these ideas. Secondly, they were very often used for legitimation, say that this is the freshest, this is the newest theory from the Western Europe. Now we should be also very innovative and introduce it. Or it was used exactly the opposite. This is the newest idea. Nobody has yet ever tried to introduce it. We shouldn't also engage in such experiment. And within this kind of lawmaking process, there was also this conceptual shift from autonomy to self-government. And this was also rooted on one hand in this kind of legal distinction between autonomy and self-government, but also kind of part of the process of adaptation, a solution for the specific Estonian context. So how the system functioned, the underlying idea was, yes, separating culture and politics. So powers of minority self-government bodies were limited to culture only. Education was the most important. So they were very much bodies of organizing education affairs, minority schools. Religion remained separate affairs. Religion was not included in the powers of these bodies of the minorities. Were interested in having these powers as well, but Estonia was very much designed as a secular state, so state institutions were not to routine religious affairs. These bodies had tax-raising powers, so members had to pay taxes into the budget, but they also got subventions from the state or municipality budget. And it was open for all minority groups with at least 3,000 citizens. They could set up their self-government, and the membership in this body was free voluntary choice of individual. So each individual could choose whether they want to or not to be included in the national list. And the membership gave these benefits that the self-government gave, such as sending children to minority schools, participating in the elections to the Minority Cultural Council, but also these obligations, paying the tax to the budget. And to look at how it functioned, I think it's worth zooming in on the case of Jewish cultural self-government body. And I think the Jewish case is very important here because very often Estonian interwar kind of ethnic relations are seen through the binary lens between Estonians and Baltic Germans. But I think a Jewish case is very important here in the Estonian context, but also more broadly because it was a small community. But at the same time, if you look at historiographies of East European Jewish communities, then this case is very often just a side note. Very often overshadowed by, for instance, the case of Lithuania, where Jewish self-government at the same time was much shorter. And if you look at the background of Estonian Jewish communities, then initially they were part of this larger body of Russian Jewish communities. And with independence, it was also kind of organizing oneself as a Jewish community of a new nation state. But very quickly, the Jewish communities formulated their own autonomy agenda in spring of 1919 and posted to the Estonian authorities. And this kind of basis enabled them to quickly set up their self-government bodies and established it in 1996. And I think there are two topics worth looking at more closely in the case of Jewish self-government. One is this kind of internal tensions that emerge and its connections with this original theory of one territorial autonomy. And the other topic is the separation of culture politics. So if you look at these earlier theoreticians, they were mostly interested in how to organize the relationship between various national communities and the state. The theory didn't pay much attention how these bodies would kind of function internally, how it would address the internal tensions. However, the Jewish community was multilingual, and basically the kind of cultural divide that emerged in the rest of East Central Europe between over the language, what should be the language, national language of Jewish communities, this also kind of emerged very prominently within this self-government body. So in the Estonian case, the supporters of Hebrew as the national language, they gave majority in the body and then kind of implemented policies supporting Hebrew language and argued that Hebrew should be the language of instruction at the schools. And of course, there was this strong vocal Yiddishist, pro-Yiddish, more left-wing opposition who countered these policies. And this pro-Yiddish minority very often even brought this kind of internal conflict to the broader public and published articles in Estonian newspapers and sometimes tried to kind of gain broader support from the society, arguing that this initially purely cultural body is now turned into party tool of a specific faction. And the other question is this kind of culture and politics, because this language divide was, of course, a part of this larger political divide. Pro-Hebrew circles were also orientated towards Zionism and framed, for instance, the entire project larger within the larger project of Zionism and establishing Jewish state in Palestine. In more practical terms, what it meant, they, for instance, occasionally budgeted some funds for various Zionist organizations. And in 1936, the self-government also sent an official delegate to participate in the World Zionist Congress. And of course, the pro-Yiddish faction fiercely opposed to this and claimed that this is now purely political. And I think here it's also worth looking at the question of Zionism in this context a bit more broadly. If you look at work of Derek Pendler and Tatjana Lichtenstein, they have argued that Zionism stressed the importance of cultural nation-building dimension of Zionism in this context. And how, as Tatjana Lichtenstein has argued in the Czechoslovak context, Zionism was not an exit strategy, rather a ticket of admission into the Czechoslovak state. And I think this is also very nicely kind of applicable, this idea in the Baltic and Estonian context. Body kind of enabled local nation building via local schooling and kind of incorporating the Jewish communities as a group into the fabric of the state. And I mean, these steps, which can be seen as political, would have been for the state authorities ideal excuse to intervene in the Jewish affairs, but actually these topics were never really taken up by the state authorities who kind of supervise these bodies. And here it's interesting to compare the Jewish self-government case with the Baltic Germans. Baltic Germans were, of course, under much stronger scrutiny of the public, of the state authorities. And in 1933, after Hitler's rise to power, National Socialists gained the upper hand in the local Baltic German party, a separate body from the Baltic German self-government. But the state as a warning sign and dissolved the German Cultural Council and organized new snap elections kind of to stem spread of national socialism. So it kind of interestingly shows the different approaches to by the state authorities to. And before I move towards conclusion, I think it's also worth looking at the international arena. So immediately after Estonia introduced the law on cultural self-government, there was a big, strong international positive response. The Baltic Germans themselves, they engaged in this broader international campaign of promoting this autonomy form. They published articles in international newspapers, circulated to law. Here from the slide, you can see how they immediately reported to the League of Nations that this law had been passed. And there was indeed kind of a fruitful ground for this kind of activism because interwar Europe was intensively discussing over the situation, the rights of minorities within the nation states. And there are, I think, two cases which are worth a closer look. One is the European Nationalities Congress, which was established in 1925. It brought together minorities across Europe, and they claim to speak on behalf of 40 million minority individuals across Europe, mostly from East Central Europe. Ewald Mende, a Baltic German from Estonia, was the general secretary of the body, and the Germans and Jews were the two main minorities in this body. And their goal basically was to introduce the cultural autonomy model based actually on the Estonian example internationally, kind of replace the minority treaty system with some sort of international cultural autonomy arrangement under the protection of the League of Nations. The League of Nations never really picked up, was never really convinced by this goal, but it became, for many minority communities across Europe, became an important model solution. And the other case worth looking at is the pan-European established by Richard over Kalergi. Kalergi also sought to collaborate with the European Nationalities Congress, was thinking how should the minority question be organized within the future united Europe. He was in close contact with an Estonian diplomat, Karel Robert Pusta, Estonian ambassador in Paris, and commissioned Karel Robert Pusta a report on minority protection in future Europe, in future United States of Europe. Pusta himself, he fully rejected the idea that there should be some sort of internationalized cultural autonomy arrangement, mostly bringing up several kind of legal issues that would emerge. He said it's just a mere liberal experiment and it's not ready to be international. However, in 1932, when there was another pan-European Congress in Basel, Gudenhofer Kalergi cracked the new pan-European program for the United States of Europe. And there he argues that the minority question should be solved based on the example of Switzerland and Estonia in the future states of Europe. So it was only kind of short passage in the program, but I think this pan-European movement is important in the case because the pan-European movement was a relatively high-scale political movement involving state heads, ministers, and so on, whereas, for instance, Minority Congress, which has featured quite prominently in literature, was mainly minority activists who had much less influence within their native states. And moving closer to conclusion, in December 1939, the Jerusalem newspaper Jüdische Weltrundschau declared Estonia is the only country of the diaspora that has a Jewish parliament, end of quote. And here you can see how the Welt is printed over because it had just recently relocated from Berlin to Jerusalem. But yeah, this article referred to the Estonian Jewish cultural self-government body, which I read earlier. And as you can see from the other quote, which I won't read out, it shows how there was immediately after introducing to law this broad, strong, positive response, and even the kind of the original political intellectual milieu, the Austrian Social Democrats, they were happy to see that their original ideas had been now finally been materialized. Although the party never officially adopted it as a policy. But I think these two cases, and all the previous cases that I treated in my talk, they nicely show how the idea of non-territorial autonomy, collective minority rights, circulated in Europe in the early 20th century. So I covered only some episodes that are on this slide, but what it shows that there was really a rich debate over this form of autonomy in Europe at the time. Estonian legislation, Estonian debates were part of this debates, and this legislation was born at an intersection of various ideas and influences. And when it was introduced, then it also kind of became an important part, an important element in the discourse of group rights in interwar Europe. I think I would finish here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Timo. That was very stimulating, and I would venture to suggest quite important for historians, but also for how we think about our current age and how we think about the complexities of governance in 21st century Europe. Your paper was superficially about the 1920s. I would suggest it was also about the 2020s in many ways, because it seems to me that the issues of how we combine collective and individual rights and collective rights at different levels seems to me very, very central to the uncertain trajectory of the European Union in the 2020s. We're a long way, aren't we, from 1989? We're a long way from a kind of springtime of the people's discourse. They still believe in it in Cambridge. But here we know that in many ways those sort of national rebirth stories of 1989 are much more complex than being, in some sense, a story of liberation and of collective self-identity. We can recognize, and you show it so well, that in many ways all nations are a crude simplification, and they are an attempt, almost to borrow Ernest Renan, it's a daily attempt to defy gravity, to assert the existence of a nation. And nobody knows that better than Belgians, who've just spent 553 days trying to work out how to construct the regional government of Brussels, which is supposed to be the capital of the European Union, and without success. So it's that sort of sense of the ungovernability of many polities in 21st century Europe because of the complexity of different levels and different identities, and of course now also different political traditions of left and right and so on, is something that is very much part of our time. And it seems to me that what's really important about your paper is the way in which it takes us back 100 years in order to confront our present and to see in these issues of how the Estonian Parliament in 1925 decided to create this phenomenon of non-territorial autonomy is also a tool by which we might think about our present. Your paper, like all good papers, is in many ways an act of historical reconstruction, which takes, I imagine, everybody in this room into territories with which they are far from entirely familiar. Most obviously, the history of Estonia, which has been deplorably neglected in many areas of Western Europe over the last 70-odd years, but also into other slightly lost territories. I don't know. Is late Habsburg thinking about nationalism really a lost territory? There was a time when it was very central to how we thought about the 20th century world, but I think it's probably people like Renner and so on have to be reasserted as being social democrats who were thinking quite seriously about better ways of thinking about nationhood than drawing lines on maps. And we want to recover them in a manner of Stefan Zweig from the sort of the crudity of what happened after 1918 in terms of the emergency attempts to draw lines of national frontier across Europe and then to move populations to fit those national lines, which is what we associate with the interwar years. So you bring back to us that complex heritage. add to it because you bring in the importance of the Russian Romanov Bolshevik nexus into all of this, which is clearly central to the fate of Estonia in that period, but needs to be more in our minds than is often the case. So it's about what I find interesting in what you say is the way in which we see people debating in St. Petersburg as much as in Vienna, how you actually think about reorganizing the Russian imperial territories in order to create a greater regime of freedom with or without a Tsar and so on. And we know what happened next. And we know that the Bolsheviks on the whole just cut to the chase and decided to establish national boundaries within the USSR with certain, as you say, certain rights for people like Volga Germans and so on at different moments, and indeed Jewish populations. But that lost heritage of thinking on the northeastern corner of Europe is, I think, something that's very important, and something that you could also bring into the frame is the complexity of thinking about Finnish identity after 1970 and 80, because of the extent to which that too was a competition zone between different definitions of the Finnish nation. So you bring that in, but you also bring in then the complexity of thinking in the 1920s among intellectuals and diplomatic groups about minority rights, about the League of Nations. No paper in this room is complete without ritual reference of Kudryava Kalevgi, the man who seems so much more influential in retrospect than he did at the time, but whose ideas are a kind of eternal sort of brown tub of half-developed thoughts about the identity of Europe in the 20th century. And finally, of course, you also bring into it this sense of a kind of liberal legal realm of how rights are to be defined and how rights are to be protected. And you bring into it the very emphatic Estonian example of non-territorial autonomy, which is something that, of course, has come up at different moments in European history. Listening to you, I was also thinking about 19th century Spain and the extent to which the liberties of different regions of Spain were often asserted in an ancien regime discourse against the modern concept of liberty in the singular. Liberties that groups might be able to enjoy, liberties that particular cities might be able to enjoy. Okay, cities are territorial, but they're also human populations, aren't they? And I think that sense that actually you see coming back in your rhetoric echoes ideas that might, in some respects, be rather ancien regime in their original conception. But they are ideas that clearly exist within a broad-ranging liberal legalist culture, as personified by your Jewish council with its splendid men in suits standing staring out into what they didn't know was the abyss. You know, so it's that sort of last moments of a liberal legal regime in particular corners of Europe, which is so poignant in what you talk about. So the idea that in recovering this lost heritage, we are discovering something that might have been better seems to me to be the sort of delusion that Oxford can suffer from on a dark February night. You know, what we're really interested in here is probably the inevitable failure of models of complexity. It was simply too complex. It was often people who had the pretension to be bureaucrats, had the pretension to be administrators, had the pretension to be lawyers, to be able to find a complex solution. And wouldn't the history of Wales be so much easier if you divided up into different ethnic groups and so on? Yes, I mean, we've lived through those moments of devolution regimes, haven't we? And Ireland, I suppose, was also a crude simplification in the 1920s as much as Estonia. So most of these regimes were doomed to fail because they were simply too complex. They also, because they were too complex, they didn't work, which is, of course, a Belgian conclusion. But in your work, there's also this sense that actually not all minorities were equal. And you mentioned the fact that the Swedes and the Russians don't require autonomous cultural councils and so on in the manner of the Jewish and other minorities. And that's very interesting, isn't it? What is the qualifying level? One might add to that, of course, always the lost Romany history of Europe in the 20th century, who never quite get to be registered in any formal way. And so a lot of these minority groups that you describe are also not natural communities, but petty tyrannies. They're the ascendancies of particular social groups within the population. And I like the way in which you describe the evolution within the ethnic German community from a former landowning kind of gentry community to a much more professional, territorial, we've got doctoral qualifications type community. You know, and they exercise the social and intellectual power that is being done to people at the same time as people are being declared to be liberated by these freedoms. So this is, sad to say, probably in many ways a dead end in history, but historians like dead ends, and that's really interesting about your subject. And what's also interesting about your subject is that dead ends are never permanent. To get back to where I started, you know, it seems to me that in the Europe of the 21st century, you see a lot of these ideas coming back. You see them coming back in Black Lives Matter. You see them coming back in LGBTQ campaigns. These are notions of the communities that ought to be allowed to exist and ought to have collective rights within polities. And we have that great friend of every minority, the European Union, to come along and stick up road signs in different languages and so on and celebrate the diversity of European identity. And therefore, in many ways, your work provides a lesson for the present day about the sheer complexity of trying to think about how we combine different rights across it. Distrust any nation that declares itself to be homogenous, even the French, and actually see that within those national identities, there is in fact a massive amount of diversity and indeed of inner conflict, a truth of which I suspect we will be sadly reminded in Ukraine over the coming years, with the idea of the celebration of Ukrainian identity always being threatened by various forms of diversity. So it's great. What you're doing about the 1920s speaks to us in the 2020s. And that seems to make your work, to me, really rather important.
Longer now, or should we present some questions?
I'll just thank for this very rich reflection, opening so many important themes. But yeah, I think it's good to move to collect some questions.
Excellent. So I think what we'll do is we'll take 3 questions at a time for Timo, and we can start the gentleman.
Thank you very much, David Malcolm, ESC. Thank you for an excellent presentation, very interesting piece from our Discussant. Can I ask a very simple question? How does Estonia differ from e.g. Latvia? And why?
And thank you for introducing yourself. I forgot to mention it is the custom here for people to name themselves or asking their questions. In the back, green sweater.
Thanks. Okay, so Ignacio Curado, the fellow here at the ESC. So I have 2 questions. You have described this as very much part of sort of like Estonia's independence DNA, but I was wondering, what if there was any level of contestation within the Estonian state when this was passed? So whether this was politicized, and also to think about this a bit, more dynamically. So what happens then, later on? So one thing is when this is established, but again, very often when groups get autonomy, they're very happy at the beginning, but then they want a bit more. Or groups that are happy to concede on that, then there's a political entrepreneur that tries to politicize it. So was there any type of process here involved after this was passed?
Sandra Leon, a fellow at the ESC. Thank you very much, Timo, for your wonderful presentation. I have a couple of comments. The first one is that you mentioned that the Baltic Germans, they were very important campaigners. And I was wondering to what extent that had to do with the fact they wanted to protect some privileges. And that taps into the relationship between autonomy and the protection of certain interests. And ultimately about, whether autonomy might give rise to inequalities, right? The second comment, it taps into what Ignacio just said. So what we know from autonomy with territory is that it might eventually trigger self-reinforcing dynamics whereby initial levels of autonomy are not enough, and the demands might escalate, ultimately escalate. So I was wondering whether that might be something similar to the dynamics unfolded by non-territorial autonomy. And if I may, just a third comment on whether it's connected to this one, and whether to what extent non-territorial autonomy might be the initial phase of further demands that eventually turn into territorial demands for those groups.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a lot of questions worthy of another presentation. Even I'll start with the Latvian case. I mean, the starting position for Estonia and Latvia was almost identical. Also, small nation, previously non-dominant, and so on. What Latvia did, they also introduced autonomy. It was schooling autonomy, limited to schooling autonomy of minorities. And they never really fully established kind of more broader overarching autonomy model as Estonia did. And the difference, I think even more prominent difference comes here with Estonian authoritarian coup in 1934. And this, I think, also helps me to reflect on the other questions, namely after the authoritarian coup in Estonia, and already a bit before, some of the powers were gradually kind of limited or taken away from, since Estonian public sphere. Since the second half of the 1930s was increasingly kind of Estonianized, since German language signs were limited. Things like restrictions on ethnic belonging, the freedom of determining ethnic belonging was chipped away. The bodies were then taken under much stronger scrutiny of state authorities. And I think, yeah, during the authoritarian period, Estonia was more strongly kind of, on the one hand, became more strongly what we would call the nationalizing state. And on the other hand, it was also kind of designed now as corporate state, kind of authoritarian state of kind of corporations. And these minority self-governments were now kind of became part of this kind of authoritarian corporatist state with limited powers. But important is that these bodies remained in place, and this kind of distinguishes Estonia from Latvia, because when Latvia had the coup in the same year, schooling autonomy was almost immediately ended. And if we now look, there was this French question of privileges and so on. So yeah, there is this kind of, I see the connection, kind of this genealogy of this self-government model can be traced back definitely to kind of privilege-based noble knighthoods, noble self-government bodies, kind of initially patches came partially in the Baltic German context from there. But in a way, it also, the Baltic Germans case kind of speaks against it, in this sense that when Estonia became independent, as the case with Latvia, both introduced radical land reforms. So this large land property was nationalized of the former nobility. And there is, some historians argue that this self-government arrangement was kind of compensation for losing former political power, economic power by land ownership. So you would now have instead cultural rights in the form of self-government. With my account, I kind of want to kind of show the complexity of this story, because if we bring in the Jewish case, then the story becomes definitely more complex, and then we have this connection more strongly with this within the entire former Russian imperial space. And yet this connection with territorial and non-territorial, I think more broadly, if there is whatever nationality, if they are some sort of ethnic, territorially compactly settled, or if there is a possibility of having some sort of territorial unit, then usually this is kind of the chief goal, be it within federation, be it within nation state. And very often I think that territorial autonomy tends to be kind of a softer option. If you observe more broadly various various cases. So I think very often the territorial option is kind of the preferred first choice, and then other options follow.
We have a question from Paul, and then Joanne.
Timo, thank you very much. So it's very, very impressive. I was surprised when you showed the slide in 1925, just how small the percentage of Baltic Germans, I think Jews and Russians. I mean, Baltic Germans were 2% and Jews less than 1%, Russians, I think 10% or something. So I guess my question is about the effect of these cultural rights, because it is certainly getting a lot of international publicity in terms of being a kind of progressive model. But is it one in which this becomes an important signal to, let's say, Baltic Germans around the Baltics that actually this is a safe haven? And did that then increase immigration? If it did, I imagine for the state, that's not quite what they wanted, right? It's one thing to acknowledge the rights of Baltic Germans that had been there for a long time, as you say, a kind of soft cultural autonomy model. It's another that they created a safe haven which attracts even more Germans and more Jews and possibly more Russians. So is there kind of an anxiety about borders? Because it's one thing to grant autonomy, but to have kind of free movement of people, that's a different issue. Did it move into this area about suddenly the need to kind of police borders differently?
Yeah, thank you, Timo. I'm Salvo Lorenzini from the University of Trento, a place where this topic is kind of very much a topic. So thank you so much. A place where this non-territorial autonomy has become very territorial, actually, with the Gasperi Agreement 1946. But I have a fascinating paper. I have two questions. I have many, but I stick to two, and a very, very, very plain one. The first one is about Lutz and Cruz. What were they for a job? So, because yes, they wrote these two things, but what were they in their communities, right? Were they lawyers? So like I have my PhD student now, but has been working on Romania and on intellectuals like that. I think mostly they were lawyers, right? I was wondering whether these two guys also were or not. And then the big question mark is you avoided talking about the League of Nations regime, I believe. So then the big question is, okay, so what is the relationship between this non-territorial autonomy people and the minority regime at the League of Nations? It was very varied, very composed, and made of many things. Were they part of it properly or not really?
So Joanna and this from Oxford, but I work on an earlier time period, which is going to be my question. So I'm just going to make Timo's life more difficult. I'm going to make a comment and then ask a question. So Martin pulled the discussion forwards. I also want to pull it backwards, but I think his point about the ancien regime devices for coping with this is very apposite. If we took a long view of this subject, perhaps we might say that there are a whole set of historic devices for coping with this. Part of what's happening, the rise of new ideas, including the idea of the nation, traditionally, which is not a territorial unit, but a kind of national community that may exist within other states and be self-governing and so forth. So perhaps what's happening with the rise of new ideas of the nation, end of the 18th, early 19th century, is some of those old solutions are getting marginalized. There's a problem about whether you can find new solutions. So both the rise of the idea of the nation state and the development of the idea that voting ought to be territorial rather than corporate kind of push older solutions to one side. So I can think of some early 19th century contexts in which you can see the issue hasn't gone away, like Congress of Vienna saying, well, the Poles are split up between three countries, but all those countries have got to agree to do something about Polish identity, but it's not specified what. Or the Greeks, when they get a nation state, which they think is too small, developing a diasporic conception of citizenship, which their consuls abroad a service. But both of those are very imagination is a bit restricted by the new political terms that people are thinking in. They say there's a problem, but they don't have a solution. So the question was, your people seem to be referring back to Austrian thinking, but one could have a much, much wider canvas. You mentioned Switzerland very briefly at the end. And I wondered if you had simplified it down to being an Austrian reference point, or whether it really is the case that that's what they talk about and they don't try to think about a larger canvas in which one might sometimes think.
Thanks again. Another set of questions, which could be another paper regarding immigration and whether this model somehow affected immigration. Then the answer would be no, that it didn't kind of reflect in immigration. And in immigration, it was, in the case of Baltic Germans, rather the other way around. There was this slow, gradual move to Germany and so on. So it didn't necessarily reflect. And also, like many other countries, when the Hitler rose to power, Estonia wasn't eager to accept refugees, for instance, initially. So it didn't really reflect on immigration. But what was the problem? Perhaps if you look at dynamics, and what was one topic that I didn't cover is this: why Estonia also introduced all these restrictions gradually. The problem was for Estonian politicians was still the enduring attractiveness of German culture and language and so on. So there was this kind of group of people who were somewhere in between, and some wanted to send children to German schools, for instance, instead of Estonian schools. So that was one of the reasons why the state introduced restrictions on these topics. If you look at the activists, then Lutz was actually a chemist by training, specialized on oil shale chemistry, so a totally different profession. Cruz was a historian, an aspiring historian. He worked as a teacher initially, and later was actually a history professor in Estonia. And he was later in 1940 very important when the Soviet puppet government was installed. Then he was vice prime minister actually. So his kind of political career was towards the end of, or later, second half of his life. But yeah, this was.
Did he survive the war?
He survived, but he suffered under kind of Stalinist repression. Lost his job at one point and so on, but he survived. And yet, most of the activists were very often lawyers, but it was a rich body of different individuals. For instance, August Spindler, whose work I had on the slide there, he was actually a doctor and published widely on medical issues, but also was very well versed in nationalities issues. So multiple backgrounds here. And if we look at the League of Nations, then the minority treaties that emerged, they offered actually they didn't include such a strong autonomy provisions. So Estonian system was definitely in a way much more muscular than what the League of Nations expected. And these initial proposals by, for instance, Jewish delegations to the Paris Peace Conference and so on, they put forward much stronger demands. So what was in the end introduced with the League of Nations treaties was much softer version, and the Estonian kind of system was separate. I mean, it devolved in kind of conversation and so on with this League of Nations systems, but it wasn't simply formulating League of Nations obligations, because I mean the manifesto was earlier, the constitution was already earlier, so on. But yeah, as I mentioned, this European Nationalities Congress, they kind of tried to bring this domestic legislation under the League of Nations system. And here, these other reference points. I think these other reference points, which are important here in my stories, is both kind of pre-existing historical group specific, like as I mentioned, this Baltic German nobility, self-governance arrangement, and also the Jewish case, this Jewish historical religious self-government, pre-existing systems across East Central Europe, which I think here perhaps served more in practical terms. There was this pre-existing experience of being organizing your internal affairs, and then it was easy to kind of translate it into political demands and then functioning institutions.
In the back, yes.
Timothy Gardner, ESC. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Since Austro-Hungarian thinking was so important in the intellectual genealogy of this, two questions. First of all, were the people who were designing this non-territorial cultural autonomy looking at what was happening in the Habsburg successor states and maybe talking to the people who were facing the same kind of challenges, for example, in Masaryk's Czechoslovakia, which would share many of the same sort of fundamental values? And secondly, in your own work, are you looking at it comparatively? I mean, I think it'd be quite interesting to look at how, for example, Czechoslovakia tackled this by comparison with how Estonia did.
Yeah, Mihan Kiro, associate professor here at ESC. So two questions. First, thank you for the great presentation. So the first question is whether the motives that drove these elites to take the decision to have this kind of very progressive settlement had to do with the fact that they were feeling threatened by the minorities, by the sort of political demands that could follow, or they, as you alluded also, would they hope that the Estonian diaspora and neighboring Eastern big neighbor would also benefit from such a progressive cultural arrangement? And then I was also, I mean, I'm a political scientist, so of course I'll ask about the afterlife of this, right, in 90s and 2000s in Estonia, right? So it's a very different reality for minorities initially, but then quite a large part, substantial part of the Russian minority does get citizenship, right, and is mobilized politically. And political scientists like Yarovny would argue that helps actually the liberal pole of politics in Eastern Europe, right? And those countries in Central and Eastern Europe that managed to mobilize national minorities have, in a way, escaped the kind of far-right democratic erosion process that happened in Poland, Hungary, and other parts where these rights of minorities weren't contested and politicized, right? So I was curious whether there is an afterlife of this, or whether, I don't know, politicians from the center party, are they referring to this heritage of the interwar Estonia or not?
Ben, did you have a question? We'll do another round afterwards.
My name's Ben Martin. I'm visiting from Estonia, Sweden. Yeah, thank you. Join the chorus of praise for your excellent paper. So I'm not Swedish, but I'm thinking about Swedish history and thinking about the Swedish minority in Finland. And in this case, one question I have, just a matter of fact, if you could illuminate a little bit. It seems like an interesting case where the minority that is pushing for this is traditionally very powerful. At the same time, that this is in the context, as I understood it, of large-scale land reform. So this minority is being expropriated, which in many national cases, as we know, is only even possible once there's been large-scale violence. Or, and so I got a little confused. How is this possible that you can sort of grant this nice cultural gesture at the same time that there's this large-scale appropriation? And then I wondered if you wanted to say anything about the case of the Swedish case, the Swedish minority in Finland, which is similarly a traditionally powerful group, which has also arranged a kind of cultural deal in Finland, which I don't know anything about in detail, but I'm sure you do. So, and then my second question was going to be a less sophisticated version of yours, so I'll let you answer that.
Also, I may have been zoning out.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks a lot for excellent questions regarding successor states. I mean, in the parliamentary discourse and in the work of these Baltic German activists, there isn't much connection with the successor states. But this successor state, Habsburg successor state, dimension really comes in within the European Nationalities Congress, when really the delegates from also Habsburg successor states are involved and engaged in these debates and activism for autonomy. And if you think about the motifs of political elites, then this threat dimension, I wouldn't emphasize it, but I think this international dimension comes into play a bit because this land reform caused kind of damage the reputation of Estonia. There were some Baltic German noblemen, for instance, Alphonse Heiking, who kind of operated as an agent on the international arena, League of Nations, at the Croatia Society here, very often kind of framing Estonian land reform as an attack, explicit attack on minorities. So I don't have kind of very direct evidence that Estonian politicians adopted this law to counter this, but definitely having passed this law, this helped to kind of go to the international arena and say that we have this autonomy arrangement to counter this kind of image damaging campaign on the international arena. And regarding the afterlife, it certainly had afterlife. And Estonia reintroduced in 1993 the same law, kind of in a much watered down, more symbolic version. And it never really started functioning. I think Estonian kind of political elites have not been really interested, but also the minority communities themselves. Because I think, for instance, for Russian speakers, it was total readaptation from the former Soviet system, and to exchange kind of entitlements within the Soviet system to mere cultural autonomy was also not attractive. And there were also various fractions within Russian communities. Some supported it, some didn't, and so on. But I think this is a topic which definitely needs more research by historians, because it's featured very prominently in political science, for instance, but this really source-based studies, why Estonian political elites opted for this or that, and various minority communities and so on. And the Swedish minority and violence, the violence element, what I didn't mention was, yeah, this Estonian kind of war of independence. When first the Bolsheviks attacked, and then from the south, this kind of ultra-conservative Baltic German noblemen were trying to establish some sort of united Baltic duchy, but it wasn't only kind of one faction of Baltic Germans. So there was this kind of violence element, and definitely there was kind of a need to consolidate the state. What is perhaps more immediately before passing this law was 1924, 1st of December. There was this attempted communist coup to overturn the government and establish a communist regime. So some historians have claimed that this law was now introduced to kind of consolidate the state after this coup attempt. But I think if you look at how far the debates in the parliament had gone by that point, so it came further impetus, but this wasn't introduced. And yet there was this Swedish minority in Estonia. They were initially, in the early phase, they were more involved, but the Swedish minority also enables us to focus on these kind of territorially focused rights, because within the Estonian system, there were also various rights which could be claimed within municipalities. For instance, when a specific minority is in a majority in a specific municipality, then you could more easily organize schooling and then have even minority languages, the main working language of the municipalities and so on. So Swedes could use these rights because they were predominantly territorially compact on the coast, and some communities as well on the water.
We had a couple of questions in the back. The gentleman in the page.
Were any of these ideas supported in Lithuania, which is the one Baltic state that you have not mentioned before?
Is there another question? Yes, it's back here.
Sorry. Dr. Jennifer Singa, I'm a professor at the University of Denver from the US. And my question is, in regards to the current economic and social instability within the Cuban government, and right, its long-standing role with the U.S. and these Cuban relations, could these interwar like models of non-territorial autonomy offer some useful comparative lens for thinking about these internal stabilities within these governments that are very much dependent on these like more hierarchies of powerful governments, especially with the, I find the timing of the Castro regime really coming into power comparatively a little bit more than coincidental. Thank you.
Well, I think I get to ask a question now. Yeah, it's, I was really struck by an idea you mentioned in passing, which was this notion of non-territorial autonomy as kind of a slick new technology of governance, right? That was going to enable it was going to lubricate and offload various sort of tensions, and the ways in which, of course, small new states can sometimes, present themselves as leapfrogging, over older ones in terms of introducing sort of new forms of governance. But of course, in the end, this also created new tensions, and this brings me back to Martin's comments about the complexity of such arrangements. And actually, I wonder if that's really the issue, or is it that they were too simple? Because they're still based on a national principle with its homogenizing and logic and exclusivist logic, right? And you see that really in the plight of the Yiddishists, who, the Bund had sort of come to a national logic somewhat reluctantly, for all sorts of good reasons, but for practical reasons, ultimately, was pushed in that direction. And then what happens in Estonia is basically their worst nightmare, which is that they're still arguing with the Hebraists and the Zionists, but the latter now have state backing, right? So the question is really like, was there any way of escaping the national logic? Or was it so hegemonic that no one was able to articulate any alternatives? And I guess one area I would be interested to know if you've looked at is people switching between different national inscriptions, or was it possible to hold multiple national inscriptions?
Thanks again for another set of excellent questions regarding Lithuania. Again, Lithuania introduced also autonomy, but this was more specifically Jewish autonomy arrangement based on the pre-existing Kehillah system. But this was abolished quite quickly because Lithuania took the authoritarian path much sooner. But the roots are in a way shared, and they engaged in very similar debates in Lithuania. Now, Cuba, I know very little about, unfortunately, about the Cuban context, but I think this study really, looking at this specific model, both from the theoretical and practical angle, it really helps us to think if somebody has an idea to introduce some sort of governance system like this. It really, you can draw policy proposals out of it if you want to, how to design functions, non-territorial governance systems. And the complexities and how to escape the national logic. There were some thinkers, activists, who kind of pushed this idea even further. And one was a Baltic German from Latvia, Paul Schiemann, and he argued for an a-national state, a Nationalstaat. So a state would be nationally totally neutral, and then this national affairs would be purely dealt within these self-government bodies. And there was another kind of interesting legal kind of thinking experiment by Eugen Madison, one Estonian state official and legal scholar who was involved kind of in this European Nationalities Congress, and he kind of made the thought experiment asking if Estonia is even a nation state because of this self-government arrangement, this other territorially kind of defined rights and so on. And what he also emphasized, the constitution of Estonia, at least in the 1920s, it defined that each individual is free to determine their ethnic belonging. So he argued that theoretically it would be possible that individuals would opt for some sort of other nationality, and the kind of the state could change the color in terms of national sense, that people would opt for German nationality instead. But I mean, yeah, in a way, that's the other thing of this self-government model. It kind of very much expects that this belonging ethnicities, you kind of fix it into one certain box and you kind of stick to it. But at the same time, if you look at the Jewish community, for instance, there was a number of families who didn't opt to send children to the Jewish schools. They opted for instance, German or Estonian schools instead because they thought that Jewish schools. Also, people were kind of moving.
Well, I think we should thank Timo for a really stimulating conversation and great discussions.